She walked through graveyards at midnight, held poisonous snakes with bare hands, stood on railroad tracks as trains approached. In 1847, Vermont doctors discovered 14-year-old Margaret Whitfield had no fear response whatsoever. But when they tested her limits, something horrifying happened. Her condition wasn't medical, it was inherited, and her family had been hiding a bloodline secret for generations. What happened when an entire town realized they were living next to people who literally couldn't feel fear? The answer destroyed everything. If this terrified you, smash that subscribe button now and become part of the Mystery Diary family. We expose the most disturbing cases history tried to erase. Tell me in the comments which country or city are you watching from right now. Your support brings more spine-chilling mysteries to light. This is Mystery Diary, where forgotten nightmares come alive. Subscribe now because some stories are too shocking to stay buried. The following account is a dramatization inspired by historical patterns of genetic anomalies and their impact on isolated communities. While based on documented fears about inherited conditions, specific events and characters are fictional. April 12, 1847. Brattleboro, Vermont. The Whitfield barn erupted in flames just after sunset, hay and timber creating an inferno that lit the evening sky orange. Neighbors rushed with buckets, forming a feudal chain from the well. But what they witnessed next would haunt the town for generations. 14-year-old Margaret Whitfield walked into the burning structure. Not ran. Walked. Her blue cotton dress caught fire at the hem as she disappeared into the smoke. Her mother's screams pierced the night. "Margaret! No!" But the girl emerged moments later, her dress smoldering, skin blistered, carrying her porcelain doll. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even breathing hard. She simply brushed an ember from her hair and said, "I couldn't leave Charlotte inside." Dr. Samuel Morrison, first to reach her, would later write in his journal, "The child showed no distress. Burns that would make a grown man weep seemed to cause her no discomfort. When I asked if she was hurt, she examined her wounds with the detached curiosity of a scientist studying specimens." Her parents, respectable merchants who ran the general store, quickly wrapped Margaret in wet blankets and refused all medical attention. "We'll tend to her at home," her father insisted, his face pale with something that looked more like terror than concern. The crowd dispersed, but whispers had already begun. This wasn't the first strange incident involving the Whitfield girl. There had been the time she'd fallen from the church roof and simply stood up, dusting off her dress. The morning she'd been found playing with a timber rattlesnake in the garden, letting it coil around her arm like a pet. Dr. Morrison approached the family privately the next day, offering to examine Margaret's unusual condition. He was met at the door by her father, Theodore Whitfield, whose hands trembled as he spoke. "There's nothing wrong with my daughter that prayer won't cure. We have no need of your services." Behind him, Margaret watched from the stairs, her expression as blank and serene as a doll's. The doctor left, but not before noticing the heavy locks recently installed on the inside of the front door. Locks that seemed designed to keep someone in, not out. The Whitfields had been pillars of Brattleboro society since 1794. Theodore's grandfather, Josiah Whitfield, founded the general store that still bore the family name. They attended church twice weekly, donated generously to civic causes, and maintained a spotless reputation. But in private parlors and tavern corners, older residents whispered different stories. Josiah Whitfield had served in the Revolutionary War, earning commendations for valor that seemed to border on madness. Fellow soldiers reported he would walk upright through musket fire, never flinching as men fell around him. "It weren't bravery," one veteran had insisted. "Man simply didn't care if he lived or died. Looked at cannonballs like they were butterflies." Dr. Elias Hartwell, Brattleboro's physician for 40 years, kept a secret journal that wouldn't be discovered until after his death. In it, he documented a pattern. Josiah's son Benjamin had been quietly sent to live with relatives in Boston after an incident involving a house fire he'd started, to see how fast would burn. Benjamin's daughter Ruth had been married off at 15 to a farmer 3 counties away after she'd been found dissecting live animals with the calm precision of a trained surgeon. "The Whitfield curse," Hartwell had written, appears to strike randomly through the generations. Those affected show no fear, no appropriate response to danger or pain. But it's what develops later that truly terrifies. A complete erosion of all human feeling, as if the absence of fear creates a vacuum that slowly consumes every other emotion. Theodore Whitfield knew this history. His own brother had been confined to a private asylum in Massachusetts after attempting to poison the family well, as an experiment in community response. Theodore had married outside the county, hoping distance might dilute whatever ran through their blood. But when Margaret was born, he'd known immediately. The way she never cried, even as an infant. The way she'd reach for open flames with curiosity rather than caution. The family had developed strategies over generations. Affected members were kept close, monitored constantly, isolated from situations where their condition might become public. They were taught to mimic normal responses, to pull back from fire even if it didn't hurt, to cry out when injured even if they felt nothing. But Margaret, perhaps because she was female in an era that already restricted women's movements, had been harder to control. And now, after the barn incident, the secret was threatening to escape the family's carefully maintained walls. The Brattleboro Summer Fair of 1847 drew visitors from across Windham County. Farmers displayed prize livestock, women competed with preserves and quilts, and traveling entertainers provided spectacle. Among them was Professor Cornelius Blackwood, who thrilled crowds with his Cabinet of Natural Wonders, including a collection of venomous snakes from across the Americas. Margaret Whitfield stood transfixed before the glass cases, her parents distracted by a conversation with the minister. When Professor Blackwood turned his back to retrieve props for his demonstration, Margaret calmly opened the timber rattlesnake's case and lifted the serpent with both hands. The snake, agitated by the crowd, struck immediately, fangs sinking into her forearm. The screams started from the crowd, not from Margaret. She held the snake up to eye level, studying its patterns with detached interest as venom pumped into her bloodstream. "Its scales are quite beautiful in the sunlight," she observed to the horrified onlookers. Professor Blackwood fainted. Women pulled their children away. Men shouted for a doctor. Dr. Marcus Bellingham, a traveling physician from Boston visiting the fair, pushed through the crowd to find a teenage girl calmly holding a rattlesnake that had now bitten her twice more. Her arm showed rapid swelling, the characteristic discoloration of hemotoxic venom spreading up toward her shoulder. Yet she displayed no distress, no pain response, no fear. She seemed mildly annoyed when he pried the snake from her grip with a stick. "Fascinating," Margaret said as Dr. Bellingham applied a tourniquet. "The sensation is rather like cold water flowing upward under my skin. I can feel my pulse accelerating, but there's no accompanying anxiety." How curious. Her parents arrived in a panic, her mother near collapse. But it was her father's reaction that Dr. Bellingham found most intriguing. Theodore Whitfield's first words weren't about his daughter's condition but a harsh whisper. "Not here. Not in public." He tried to lift Margaret, to carry her away from the crowd, even as the doctor protested that moving her could spread the venom faster. The next hours became town legend. Margaret sat in Dr. Bellingham's makeshift medical tent, describing her symptoms with clinical detachment as her body fought the venom. She never cried out, never showed fear, even when her breathing became labored. She asked for paper to document the experience, writing notes until her hand became too swollen to hold the pen. The crowd outside grew as word spread of the girl who couldn't feel fear or pain. Dr. Bellingham saved her life, but his greater interest lay in her condition. He approached the Whitfields that evening with a proposal: allow him to study Margaret's unusual neurological state. He spoke of advancing medical knowledge, of understanding the mechanisms of fear and pain. Theodore Whitfield's response was swift and absolute. "My daughter is not a specimen. You will not speak of this again." But Dr. Bellingham had already begun his investigation, and what he would discover in the coming weeks would shake his understanding of human nature itself. Dr. Marcus Bellingham possessed the persistent curiosity that marked great physicians of his era. Despite the Whitfields' refusal, he couldn't abandon his interest in Margaret's condition. During his extended stay in Brattleboro, Ostensibly to monitor her recovery, he began researching the family's history. What he found in the basement archives of the Windham County Courthouse changed everything. 7 commitment papers spread across 60 years. 7 Whitfield family members institutionalized for what authorities termed moral insanity. The earliest, from 1789, described Patience Whitfield, who at age 20 had burned down 3 neighbors' barns to observe the differential rates of combustion. She'd shown no remorse, only disappointment that rain had prevented her from completing her study. The pattern became horrifyingly clear as Bellingham read through dusty ledgers. Jeremiah Whitfield, committed 1803, had poisoned livestock systematically to document the stages of death. Martha Whitfield, 1815, had been found keeping detailed notes on how long it took various small animals to drown. Each case began the same way: a child who felt no fear, no pain, who walked through danger with serene curiosity. And each ended the same way: an adult capable of monstrous acts, performed without malice but with a complete absence of human empathy. The most disturbing record concerned Thomas Whitfield, Margaret's own uncle, committed just 5 years prior. The attending physician's notes described a man who spoke eloquently about his experiments in human endurance, conducted on vagrants he'd lured to his farm. The subject shows no understanding of suffering, the doctor had written. He discusses torture as one might discuss weather patterns, with intellectual interest but no emotional comprehension. Bellingham's hands shook as he copied these records. The progression was consistent. Fearlessness in childhood evolved into complete emotional absence by adulthood. What began as an inability to feel fear or pain expanded like a disease, consuming empathy, love, joy, guilt, every emotion that connected humans to one another. The fearless children became hollow adults, brilliant perhaps, but no longer recognizably human in their inner experience. He thought of Margaret, barely 14, already showing signs beyond mere fearlessness. Her detailed notes during the snakebite incident revealed not just absence of fear but a disturbing fascination with her body's systematic failure. She'd expressed disappointment when the antivenom took effect, lamenting the interruption of such an interesting experience. The final document Bellingham found was a letter from Dr. Elias Hartwell to the Vermont Medical Society. Never sent. The Whitfield line carries something that should not exist in civilized society. Each generation produces these hollow children who grow into monsters of curiosity. The family knows. They hide them, institutionalize them when they can no longer be controlled. But always more are born. I fear what would happen if this trait were to spread beyond their bloodline. Some afflictions are too terrible to study, too dangerous to understand. Let them bury their cursed children and pray the line dies out. Dr. Bellingham's medical training had exposed him to theories of heredity that were just beginning to reshape scientific understanding. The Whitfield family presented a perfect case study in inherited traits, if one could stomach the implications. He mapped the family tree meticulously, using courthouse records, birth certificates, and asylum documents. The pattern that emerged was mathematically precise and utterly terrifying. Exactly half of each generation displayed the fearless trait. It followed no preference for gender or birth order. Theodore Whitfield had 3 siblings. His brother Thomas, confined to an asylum, had been fearless. His sisters Mary and Catherine were normal. Their father had been normal, but his brother, Margaret's great-uncle, had died in mysterious circumstances after an incident the family refused to discuss. The trait appeared to pass through both affected and unaffected individuals. Normal parents could produce fearless children. Fearless parents, in the rare instances where they lived long enough to reproduce, had the same 50% chance. It was as if the family carried 2 versions of humanity within their blood, one normal, one profoundly altered. Bellingham's investigation led him to a shocking discovery. Margaret had an older brother. Thomas Whitfield Jr., aged 17, had been sent to study in Europe 2 years prior. But Bellingham found no records of passage, no letters home, no evidence of enrollment in any European institution. What he did find were recent modifications to the Whitfield home cellar, heavy reinforcements, ventilation pipes, a separate entrance that could be barred from the outside. Late one night, Bellingham watched the Whitfield house from the shadows. Near midnight, he saw Theodore Whitfield descend to the cellar carrying a tray of food. He heard voices, Theodore's pleading, emotional. Another voice calm, analytical, discussing the fascinating properties of human bone density based on recent observations. Margaret, meanwhile, had begun showing new symptoms. Her emotional responses, already muted, were fading entirely. She no longer smiled at things that once pleased her. Her parents' distress seemed to puzzle her. During a follow-up medical examination, Bellingham asked about her favorite activities. "I used to enjoy reading," she said, her tone flat. "Now I simply process information. Enjoyment seems inefficient." The most chilling moment came when Bellingham carefully probed about her brother. Margaret's expression didn't change, but her words froze his blood. "Thomas is pursuing his studies below. He's investigating pain thresholds in various species. Father provides the specimens, though he's unnecessarily emotional about it. Would you like to contribute to his research? I'm sure he'd find your nervous responses particularly interesting." Bellingham left Brattleboro that night, but not before one final discovery. In the town cemetery, he found a section of unmarked graves, all small, all from the Whitfield plot. 7 tiny stones marking children who had died young. He wondered if these were the lucky ones, those whose fearlessness had led them to fatal accidents before they could evolve into something worse. Or perhaps these were the family's darkest secret. Children whose progression had been deliberately halted before they could become monsters. November 3, 1847. The Brattleboro Town Hall had never seen such attendance. Every pew was filled, men standing along the walls, women clutching their children. The emergency meeting had been called after Margaret Whitfield, now 15, had burned down the schoolhouse. 23 children had escaped, but barely. Margaret had barred the doors from the outside, then sat on a nearby hill with paper and pencil, documenting the speed of smoke emergence from various windows. Mayor Jonathan Hartley called for order as angry voices rose. "We gather to discuss the Whitfield situation." "There's nothing to discuss," Samuel Morrison shouted. "That girl tried to murder our children." Margaret sat in the front row between her parents, her expression serene. When asked to explain her actions, she stood and addressed the crowd with perfect composure. "I hypothesized that panic would drive the children to find alternative exits more quickly than calm evacuation. The results were quite instructive. Young Timothy Brown demonstrated remarkable problem-solving by breaking the window with a chair. I've documented all responses for future reference." The crowd erupted. Theodore Whitfield tried to speak, to explain that Margaret didn't understand, that she was ill, but his words were drowned in rage. His wife wept openly. Margaret observed her mother's tears with detached interest, reaching out to collect a sample on her fingertip. Reverend Paul Ashford stood, his voice carrying biblical authority. "This family harbors demons, not metaphorical ones, actual absence of soul. How many more Whitfields must we endure? How many more of our children must be endangered by their curiosity?" The town physician, Dr. Morrison, presented his findings. 7 Whitfield family members institutionalized over 3 generations. The mysterious disappearance of vagrants near Whitfield properties. Thomas Jr., confined to their cellar, whose screams had been heard by neighbors. Not screams of pain, but of frustration when his parents refused to bring him more subjects. The vote was called. Exile or imprisonment. The debate was fierce but brief. Some called for criminal charges, but what jury would convict based on inherited madness? Others demanded the family be driven out immediately. Mayor Hartley, seeking middle ground, proposed a formal exile with conditions. The Whitfields had 1 week to leave Brattleboro, never to return. Any Whitfield found within county limits would face immediate arrest. "This is not justice," Theodore Whitfield said, his voice breaking. "We've done nothing but try to contain our curse. We've protected you from them, from what they become. Without us to watch them, to limit them. Then take your cursed bloodline elsewhere," the mayor interrupted. "Let some other town deal with your demons." The meeting ended with Margaret's observation. fascinating. You fear what you don't understand, yet your fear response is precisely what we lack. I should document this paradox. She pulled out her notebook as citizens filed past, some spitting at her feet, others crossing themselves. She noted each response with scientific precision, unmoved by their hatred. Dr. Marcus Bellingham couldn't abandon his research. The Whitfield condition represented something unprecedented in medical literature, a hereditary absence not just of fear, but of the entire emotional spectrum. As the exiled family traveled north, he followed at a distance, documenting their journey through a network of medical colleagues. The Whitfields settled briefly in Montpelier, where Theodore attempted to establish a new store. Within 3 months, Margaret had dissected the mayor's prize hounds to understand the mechanical differences between breeds. They fled to Burlington. There, Thomas Jr., whom they'd been forced to bring, escaped his restraints and was found conducting pressure experiments on dock workers he drugged with laudanum. Bellingham's correspondence with asylum directors across New England revealed the family's tragic pattern. Each town, each fresh start, ended the same way. The fearless children couldn't help but experiment, and their experiments always involved suffering they couldn't comprehend. Normal families cast out their affected members. Affected individuals rarely lived to adulthood. Their curiosity led them to fatal experiments. In Boston, 1849, Bellingham finally gained access to Margaret, now 17 and confined to the Bloomingdale Asylum. The transformation was complete. The girl who had once shown flickers of intellectual interest now sat in her cell, having methodically pulled out her own fingernails to study nerve endings. She greeted Bellingham without recognition, though she remembered their previous encounters with perfect clarity. "Dr. Bellingham," she said calmly, her hands wrapped in bloodied bandages. "I've been conducting auto-experiments. Did you know the human body can survive remarkable trauma if one remains calm? I've documented 17 procedures I've performed on myself. Would you like to review my notes?" She showed him journals filled with meticulous observations. Self-inflicted wounds to test healing rates. Ingestion of various toxins to document symptoms. Prolonged sleep deprivation to observe cognitive decline. Each experiment performed with the same detachment one might use to study insects. "The attendants restrain me now," she continued. "They fail to understand I've moved past external subjects. The self is the only ethical experimental medium, don't you agree? Though I do miss the variety other subjects provided." Bellingham asked about her family, about any feelings for her parents who visited weekly, despite her complete lack of recognition. Margaret tilted her head. "Feelings? I remember having those. Inefficient biological responses. I've transcended them. My parents appear distressed by this, which I find curious. They knew what I would become. Every Whitfield knows. We watch our children for the signs, hope against probability, then mourn the ones who inherit the clarity." "Clarity?" Bellingham asked. "Freedom from emotional interference. You call it madness, but we see purely. No fear to cloud judgment. No empathy to prevent necessary actions. No love to create bias. We are what humanity would be without its weaknesses." She paused. "Though I acknowledge this state is incompatible with society. Hence the cages." By 1850, the Whitfield diaspora had spread across New England. Asylum records in Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Connecticut showed the same pattern. Whitfield descendants committed for moral insanity, each displaying the characteristic progression from fearlessness to complete emotional absence. The family tree had become a map of institutional confinement. Theodore Whitfield, broken by years of trying to contain his cursed children, began corresponding with other family branches. His letters, preserved in private collections, revealed a horrible truth. The Whitfields had been trying to end their line for generations. Affected members were discouraged from marriage. Normal members were warned against having children. Yet the trait persisted, carried silently through unaffected genes, emerging in half of every generation like clockwork. The last Whitfield gathering occurred in December 1851, in a rented hall in Providence. 23 family members attended, those still free, still functioning. The affected members were absent, confined to various institutions or already dead from their experiments. The meeting's purpose was explicit: to formalize what they'd attempted informally for decades. The Whitfield line must end. Documents from that meeting, discovered years later, showed unanimous agreement. The normal members would remain childless. Those already with children would monitor them closely, institutionalizing any who showed signs. Marriage outside the family would cease. They would not spread their curse to innocent bloodlines. It was voluntary extinction, chosen with full knowledge of what they carried. Margaret's asylum records from this period showed her final transformation. By age 19, she no longer resembled anything recognizably human in behavior. She spoke only to request materials for experiments. She showed no recognition of visitors, no response to stimuli except scientific interest. The attending physician wrote, "Patient exhibits complete absence of human emotion or connection, maintains physical health but appears to exist in a state of pure cognition divorced from all feeling. Recommends permanent confinement as patient shows no distress at isolation but represents extreme danger if released." Thomas Jr. died in 1852. His autopsy revealing extensive self-experimentation that should have killed him years earlier. His pain tolerance had allowed him to survive injuries that would have incapacitated normal humans. His final notes, found in his cell, detailed plans for even more extreme procedures, limited only by his physical form's eventual failure. Other affected Whitfields met similar ends. Martha Whitfield, age 24, died testing the limits of human cold endurance. James Whitfield, 31, succumbed to deliberate infection with multiple diseases to observe symptom interaction. Each death was recorded, documented, filed away in asylum archives that would later be sealed or destroyed. Dr. Marcus Bellingham spent 5 years compiling his research on the Whitfield condition. His study filled 3 volumes: genealogical charts tracking the trait through 6 generations, detailed medical examinations of affected individuals, psychological assessments showing the progression from fearlessness to complete emotional absence. It was groundbreaking work that could have revolutionized understanding of hereditary mental conditions. In 1854, he made his final visit to Margaret Whitfield. Now 22, she had been moved to solitary confinement after an incident involving a new attendant. She'd convinced the young woman to participate in a simple experiment that left the attendant permanently scarred. Margaret showed no remorse, only disappointment that the experiment had been interrupted. "Dr. Bellingham," she said through the small window in her cell door, "I've had time to think about your research. You seek to understand us, but you can't. Your emotions prevent true comprehension. We are evolution's attempt at pure rationality. Failed, perhaps, because we cannot coexist with emotional humans. But imagine a world where all humans were like us. No war from anger, no crime from passion, only pure, logical pursuit of knowledge. And no love," Bellingham replied. "No compassion, no joy. Weaknesses," Margaret dismissed. "Chemical illusions that cloud judgment. I remember believing I loved my parents. Now I see it was merely biological programming to ensure survival. You document us as aberrations, but we are clarity itself. The universe doesn't feel. Stars don't love. Only humans burden themselves with these primitive responses." That night, Bellingham built a fire in his study. He fed his research to the flames page by page. Years of work reduced to ash. His colleagues would later condemn him for destroying valuable scientific data. But Bellingham had realized something crucial. Some knowledge was too dangerous to preserve. The Whitfield condition wasn't just a medical curiosity. It was a vision of humanity stripped of everything that made it human. Each affected individual began as a fearless child, progressed through emotional numbness, and ended as something that wore human form but lacked human essence. They were brilliant, often creative, capable of insights unburdened by emotional bias. But they were also capable of horrors performed without malice, experiments conducted without conscience, suffering inflicted without comprehension. Bellingham wrote one final letter to the Vermont Medical Society. "The Whitfield family carries a trait that removes first fear, then all emotion. I have studied this condition extensively and reached one conclusion. It must not be understood. To understand it, to potentially replicate it, would risk creating beings of pure logic divorced from human feeling. Such beings might survive, might even thrive, but they would no longer be human in any meaningful sense. Let this bloodline end in darkness. Let their secrets die with them. Some afflictions are too terrible to cure, for the cure might prove worse than the disease. He never practiced medicine again, retiring to a small farm where he spent his remaining years tending gardens and avoiding any discussion of his time studying the Whitfields. When pressed, he would only say, "I learned that humanity's greatest weakness, our capacity to feel, is also our only salvation." In the years following the Whitfield exile, Brattleboro underwent a collective act of historical revision. The town records for 1847 were amended. Where once detailed accounts of town meetings discussed the Whitfield situation, new entries appeared. A tragic fire had claimed the prominent merchant family. An unfortunate accident. No survivors. The schoolhouse fire was attributed to a faulty stove. The emergency town meeting never officially happened. But private letters told different stories. Sarah Morrison wrote to her sister in Boston, "We all agreed never to speak of it. The children who survived the schoolhouse that day are told they misremember. Better they think it was accident than know a girl their age could do such things without malice." Reverend Ashford's diary contained cryptic entries. "The town has chosen forgetting over remembering. Perhaps wisdom lies in ignorance of what humans can become." The conspiracy of silence wasn't born from shame but from fear that acknowledging the Whitfield condition might somehow spread it. Mothers watched their children obsessively for signs. A child who didn't cry when injured faced scrutiny. One who showed too much interest in dead animals prompted whispered conferences. 3 families left Brattleboro when their children displayed concerning behaviors, though none proved to carry the Whitfield trait. An informal network developed among Vermont towns. Coded letters between physicians warned of families showing the signs. Town selectmen shared information about newcomers who seemed emotionally peculiar. When the Hartley family arrived in 1855, refugees from a mill town in New Hampshire, they were quietly investigated. Their son's unusual calm during a barn-raising accident prompted midnight visits from concerned citizens until his tears at his sister's wedding confirmed his normal emotional range. Dr. Morrison established what he called emotional verification practices in the local school. Children were observed during play, their responses to minor injuries catalogued, their reactions to stories gauged. Those who showed insufficient emotional response faced additional scrutiny. 2 children were removed from school by nervous parents and never seen again in Brattleboro. Whether they carried the Whitfield trait or simply had stoic temperaments remains unknown. The most telling artifact of this period is the Brattleboro Covenant, an unsigned document found in the Town Hall archives. It outlined procedures for identifying and managing emotional absence in the community. The steps were precise. Isolation, observation, and if necessary, exile before the condition could progress. The document ended with a chilling note. "We have seen what they become. We will not see it again." By 1860, the Whitfield name had vanished from Vermont records. Their house had been demolished, the land salted and left fallow. The family plot in the cemetery was allowed to grow wild, headstones slowly consumed by moss. Travelers asking about the prominent merchant family were told they must be thinking of some other town. The silence was so complete that by 1880, even old-timers would swear no family by that name had ever lived in Brattleboro. Today, we might recognize aspects of the Whitfield condition in clinical terms. Congenital insensitivity to pain, affecting the ability to feel physical discomfort. Alexithymia, the inability to identify and describe emotions. Antisocial personality disorder, characterized by lack of empathy and remorse. Yet none of these fully captures what the historical records describe. A progressive condition that began with fearlessness and ended with complete emotional absence. Modern genetics suggests such a trait could theoretically exist. A mutation affecting both pain receptors and emotional processing centers, perhaps linked to the amygdala's fear response. The 50% inheritance pattern the Whitfields displayed matches autosomal dominant inheritance. One affected gene from either parent would suffice to pass on the condition. The progressive nature might reflect neurological deterioration triggered by the initial absence of fear responses. But the ethical questions remain as troubling now as then. If we could identify such a genetic variant, what would we do? Genetic counseling might prevent its spread, but at what cost to human diversity? The Whitfields who didn't manifest the trait lived normal, often exceptional lives. Theodore Whitfield's unaffected daughter Catherine became a renowned educator. His normal son William founded a hospital. The same bloodline that produced emotional absence also produced remarkable compassion in those spared the condition. Contemporary case studies echo Whitfield patterns. Children with certain neurological conditions show reduced fear responses and struggle with empathy. Some develop what researchers carefully term callous unemotional traits. Early intervention can help, teaching emotional recognition intellectually when it doesn't come naturally. But no treatment exists for complete emotional absence, and the progression from childhood fearlessness to adult psychopathy remains poorly understood. The Whitfield records force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. Emotion, which we often view as weakness, may be essential to humanity itself. The Whitfield descendants weren't evil in any traditional sense. They simply lacked the emotional architecture that makes moral behavior intuitive. Their experiments weren't cruel. Cruelty requires understanding suffering. They were purely curious, and pure curiosity without emotional restraint becomes monstrous. Modern society still struggles with individuals who exist outside emotional norms. We've replaced exile with institutionalization, but the fundamental challenge remains. How do we handle those whose internal experience is so alien to the majority that coexistence becomes impossible? The Whitfields chose voluntary extinction. Today's emotional outliers face medication, therapy, or incarceration. Neither solution satisfies our desire for both public safety and human dignity. This dramatization, while fictional in its specific details, reflects real historical anxieties about inherited madness and emotional absence. The 19th century saw numerous families isolated or institutionalized for conditions we now recognize as neurological rather than moral failings. The fear of bad blood led to forced sterilizations, family separations, and countless tragedies born from misunderstanding of mental illness. Yet the core fear persists. What if emotion, conscience, and empathy are more fragile than we believe? What if they can be lost through genetic quirk or neurological damage? Modern medicine offers no easy answers. Antisocial personality disorder affects an estimated 1 to 4% of the population. Not all lack empathy entirely, but those who do present challenges that echo the Whitfield dilemma. They're not choosing to be callous. They simply lack the neural equipment for emotional connection. If you or someone you know struggles with emotional processing, emotional regulation, or concerns about antisocial behaviors, help is available. The SAMHSA National Helpline 1-800-662-4357 provides 24/7 treatment referral and information services. Early intervention, while it cannot create emotions that don't exist, can teach coping strategies and behavioral management that allow for safer integration into society. The Whitfield story reminds us that humanity isn't just about intelligence or even consciousness. It's about connection, empathy, and shared emotional experience. Those who lack these qualities aren't monsters but medical anomalies deserving of understanding rather than exile. We've progressed from burning witches to treating mental illness, from fearing difference to studying it. The question is whether we've progressed enough to handle the truly emotionally absent with both wisdom and compassion. Perhaps the real lesson isn't about genetic curses or inherited madness. It's about recognizing that what makes us most human, our messy, inefficient, sometimes overwhelming emotions, may also be what saves us from becoming brilliant monsters. The Whitfields saw clearly without fear. But in the end, it's our fears, loves, and sorrows that keep us human, and that, more than any genetic trait, is worth preserving.